one of the darkest and most lethal books ever written, led to the torture and execution of tens of thousands of innocent people. It was endorsed by the Church, printed and spread across Europe with chilling efficiency. But this was no ordinary text. It wasn't a book of wisdom or insight. It was a manual, a weapon in the war against witches, heretics, and anyone who dared to defy the religious authority of the time. Welcome back to Esoteric Legends. Today we step into a realm hidden in plain sight, where fear wore the mask of faith and words were forged into weapons. This book was called Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. Written in 1486 by Heinrich Kramer, a Dominican inquisitor, Malleus Maleficarum was not merely a theological treatise. It was a declaration of war, not just against witches, but against anyone who threatened the Church's grip on power. Kramer, obsessed with the idea that witches were corrupting society and undermining Christianity, crafted a guide that would become the foundation for witch hunts across Europe for centuries. At its core, the Malleus Maleficarum was more than just a list of accusations against supposed witches. It gave religious authorities the tools to carry out brutal persecutions, offering step-by-step instructions on how to identify, interrogate, and execute those accused of witchcraft. But it was also a deeply misogynistic text, singling out women as the primary culprits of witchcraft and demonizing them as inherently weak and vulnerable to satanic influence. In Kramer's world, a woman's independence, wisdom, or even her failure to conform to societal expectations could be grounds for accusation. The impact of this book was catastrophic. It justified the systematic torture of thousands of women, often on the flimsiest of evidence. Malleus Maleficarum didn't just document the belief in witches, it created them. By portraying witches as an imminent threat, it fueled paranoia that spread across Europe, leading to one of the bloodiest and most unjust chapters in human history, the European witch hunts. But this book didn't just disappear after the trials ended. Its legacy endures, shaping the way we think about fear, power, and persecution even today. The echoes of its impact still reverberate in how society targets and demonizes certain groups. In this video, we'll dive into the Malleus Maleficarum, its origins, its purpose, and the long-lasting effects it had on European culture. We'll explore why it was so dangerous, how it was used to manipulate society, and the horrific consequences it unleashed on the innocent. The Malleus Maleficarum wasn't just a book. It was a loaded weapon. It was written with a clear purpose, to justify and expand the witch hunts that had already begun to simmer in late medieval Europe. Its mission was twofold: to legitimize violence in the name of God, and to restore the authority of a church losing control over its people. By the late 1400s, Europe was changing. The Black Death had ravaged populations. Political power was shifting. People were questioning old structures. The church, once untouchable, was under pressure. In this chaos, fear became a tool, and fear needed a face. Heinrich Kramer gave it one. A Dominican inquisitor with a sharp pen and a bruised ego, Kramer had already been obsessed with rooting out witches. But he wasn't admired for his work. In fact, he was mocked. His extreme views were rejected by other clergy. His obsession with female sexuality, power, and independence made even his fellow inquisitors uncomfortable. In 1485, Kramer was expelled from Innsbruck after attempting to prosecute a group of women as witches. The local bishop called him unstable and accused him of being more interested in humiliating women than seeking truth. So Kramer did what many bitter men do. He wrote a book. The Malleus Maleficarum, published a year later, was his revenge, and he didn't hold back. Kramer argued that witchcraft was not just superstition or folk magic, it was heresy, a direct betrayal of the church. This move was tactical. Heresy was punishable by death, and if witchcraft could be treated as heresy, then no one was safe. According to Kramer, witches weren't rare or hidden. They were everywhere, in villages and homes, even in churches, but above all, they were women. The word femina comes from fe and minus, he wrote, meaning faith and less. Women are less faithful than men. In the world of Malleus, a woman's body was a portal for evil. Kramer described women as morally weak, sexually insatiable, emotionally unstable, and more likely to be seduced by demons. He portrayed them as natural liars whose tears were just another form of manipulation. And the most dangerous of all, older women, widows, midwives, healers, women who lived outside the control of a man, who had property, knowledge, or simply didn't conform, became prime targets. These women were accused not only of consorting with the devil, but of inflicting harm on others, causing infertility, killing babies, summoning storms, and cursing livestock. And once accused, the book gave clear instructions on what to do next. The Malleus Maleficarum was designed like a scholarly text. It quoted scripture, cited church authorities, and used the language of logic and reason. But beneath the surface, it was pure fanaticism. The book was divided into 3 parts. 1, the reality of witchcraft and why it must be believed. 2, the forms and practices of witches. 3, the legal procedures for prosecuting them. This structure gave it a false sense of legitimacy. It looked official. It sounded educated. But in reality, it was propaganda, dressed in priestly robes. The procedures described were brutal. Torture wasn't just allowed, it was encouraged. Confessions were extracted through pain, and once someone confessed, their testimony could be used to accuse others. It created a chain reaction of fear, where one accusation became 10, and 10 became 100. And because the book insisted that witches could lie or resist through demonic power, even silence was seen as proof of guilt. The Malleus warned that anyone who denied the existence of witches was themselves a heretic. So not only were accusations deadly, but questioning the system itself became dangerous. This is how the book destroyed lives. It turned suspicion into certainty. It turned gender into guilt. It handed inquisitors a loaded gun and told them to fire at will, all while wrapping itself in the language of faith and reason. Heinrich Kramer didn't create the fear of witches, but he gave it a manual, a voice, and a legal framework. His personal failures, his misogyny, and his thirst for recognition fueled a book that would outlive him for centuries. By the time the witch hunts reached their peak, thousands had been tortured and executed, many based on the ideas set down in this single text. And the most terrifying part? People believed they were doing God's work. The Malleus Maleficarum did not merely accuse, it instructed. It wasn't enough to name witches. Heinrich Kramer laid out exactly how to break them, how to silence their cries, how to force truth from suffering. This was not a book of theology, it was a blueprint for brutality. At the heart of its 3rd section lies its most dangerous contribution, a step-by-step guide for interrogating, torturing, and ultimately executing those accused of witchcraft. And not based on evidence, but on fear, suspicion, and impossible expectations. First came the arrest. It didn't take much. A neighbor's complaint, a failed crop, a stillborn child. And suddenly, a woman, often old, poor, unmarried, was bound and dragged before a tribunal. Kramer warned that witches would lie, resist, and use spells to confuse their accusers. So he offered a solution: torture them until the truth surfaced. Pain would reveal what words could not. And so, across Europe, the screams began. Suspects were stripped naked, shaved head to toe. Kramer claimed witches could hide devilish marks or talismans on their bodies. Then came the instruments: thumb screws, the strappado, iron pincers, racks to stretch limbs until joints snapped. All legal, all justified because the Malleus said so. The goal wasn't evidence, it was confession. And the more graphic, the better. Women confessed to flying through the night, consorting with demons, killing infants, and cursing animals, all under unbearable torment. Some claimed they danced with Satan himself. Others admitted to sins they didn't even understand. The accused were often illiterate, terrified, alone. They confessed just to make it stop, or worse, because they believed what their torturers told them. And this is where the book becomes even more insidious. Kramer insisted that if a woman withstood torture without confessing, it was proof she had magical protection. Resistance itself was guilt. There was no way out, no truth strong enough to stand on its own. Many were tortured multiple times. Kramer advised that breaks between sessions didn't count as repetition, so the rack could be used again and again until body and mind gave out. Once a confession was secured, it was almost always followed by execution. Burning at the stake was common, symbolic purification by fire. Some were hanged, others drowned, few survived, and these weren't isolated events. Entire communities took part. Trials became public, executions were spectacles, families turned on each other, mothers accused daughters, husbands betrayed wives. Fear spread like wildfire. The courts embraced the Malleus Maleficarum as a sacred tool. Judges, inquisitors, and priests quoted it like scripture, using it to validate every punishment, every twisted act. During the height of the witch trials, from the late 1500s into the 1600s, this book was treated as absolute authority. Across Germany, France, Switzerland, and beyond, even those who doubted its methods feared speaking out. In towns like Würzburg, Bamberg, and Trier, entire networks of accused witches were exposed, tortured, and burned. Some villages lost nearly half their population, not because of real threats, but because the book said so. The psychological impact was devastating. Trust collapsed. Fear became the language of survival. If someone looked at you wrong, you reported them. If you wanted to protect your family, you lied. If you were accused, you hoped to die quickly. Communities unraveled. Justice, once rooted in truth, became twisted by paranoia. The courts were no longer places of protection. They became chambers of horror. The Malleus had one goal: obedience. It replaced evidence with fear, mercy with punishment, and truth with pain. It destroyed not only lives, but the very idea of justice. It taught that anyone could be an enemy, that behind every smile could be a spell, that safety could only come through total submission. And worst of all, it taught this in the name of God. For hundreds of years, its influence spread through courts and pulpits alike. It laid the foundation for some of the worst atrocities of early modern Europe. And while its methods seem medieval to us now, the psychology behind it, the use of fear to control, has never disappeared. This book didn't just kill people, it trained society to kill itself. To understand the true horror of the Malleus Maleficarum, you have to enter the mind of its author and the world he believed in. In this world, the devil wasn't just real, he was everywhere, lurking in the shadows, whispering in ears, watching through the eyes of your neighbor. And witches? They were his willing agents. The Malleus Maleficarum paints a demonological universe in which the battle between God and Satan plays out through human flesh, and witches, especially women, are the battlefield. According to Heinrich Kramer, witches didn't just practice magic. They entered into explicit pacts with the devil. These weren't symbolic. They were contracts, sealed through ritual sex, blasphemy, and acts of cruelty. In the eyes of the church, this wasn't just sin, it was treason against heaven. The devil, Kramer claimed, didn't choose his servants at random. He targeted the weak, and to him, women were the weakest of all. Kramer writes, "All witchcraft comes from carnal lust, which in women is insatiable." This wasn't just a passing insult. It was the key ideological cord of the Malleus. Women, the book insisted, were more emotional, more gullible, and more desirous than men. These traits, according to Kramer, made them perfect prey for demons, and so their spiritual weakness became a public threat. This demonology warped normal life into signs of evil. Midwives were suddenly dangerous. They touched life and death, and thus were accused of killing infants in the womb or offering newborns to Satan. Herbalists and healers, practicing natural remedies, was rebranded as unnatural sorcery. A woman who spoke her mind, a wife who resisted her husband, a widow who owned property. These became red flags. In this worldview, female autonomy itself became suspicious. A woman with knowledge or control over her own body was seen as stepping out of her God-given role and into the devil's territory. The book even accused witches of stealing male genitalia and hiding them in birds' nests. That's not satire. That's a real claim from the Malleus. The level of absurdity reveals something deeper. This wasn't about truth. It was about control. Kramer's demonology wasn't just fear of the supernatural. It was a system built to reinforce submission. Women were to obey. If they didn't, they risked being labeled as witches. This thinking allowed church authorities to turn fear, misogyny, and faith into a single ideological weapon. By presenting Satan not as a distant figure, but as a constant threat, the church positioned itself as the only defense. Obedience to the church became survival. Doubt became heresy. And women's bodies became battlegrounds. But here's what's chilling. This system worked because people believed it. They genuinely feared demonic infiltration. They believed that a neighbor could curse their crops or that a midwife could steal a child's soul. Religious belief, stoked by economic hardship, disease, and death, created a perfect storm of desperation and distrust. And in the center of that storm stood the Malleus Maleficarum, offering clarity through cruelty. Its theology wasn't just about evil. It was about explaining suffering. Why did babies die? Why did food spoil? Why did disease spread? It was easier to blame a witch than to accept randomness or institutional failure. The book turned the devil into a scapegoat, but it didn't stop there. It gave him a face. And that face more often than not, was a woman's. Kramer's writing drips with personal obsession. He wasn't just trying to fight witches, he was trying to punish women who rejected him, resisted him, or embarrassed him. His failed prosecutions, especially in Innsbruck, left him humiliated. The Malleus was his revenge, not just against women, but against a church that had questioned his authority. Through demonology, he gave his vengeance a divine mask. And so ordinary women, mothers, healers, caretakers, were dragged into courtrooms, tortured and burned. Not for what they'd done, but for what they were believed to be. They weren't seen as human. They were seen as gates through which the devil could walk. In the end, the Malleus Maleficarum didn't just give us a manual for execution, it gave us a theology of suspicion. It told us that evil wears a familiar face, that anyone could be an enemy of God, that faith meant watching your neighbors, not helping them, and its legacy, it's written in ashes. The Malleus Maleficarum was never just a book, it was a weapon, disguised as theology, wrapped in the language of faith, and sharpened by fear. Its purpose was clear: to destroy. Under the pretense of protecting the church and purging evil, it legitimized persecution on a massive scale. It offered a blueprint for identifying, torturing, and executing so-called witches, most of them women, based on superstition, misogyny, and twisted logic. It turned suspicion into evidence, pain into truth, and death into divine justice. In its pages, we find no mercy, only a cold, relentless agenda. It told judges how to extract confessions, it justified torture by calling it holy, and it equated natural wisdom, like midwifery and herbal medicine, with satanic power. It wasn't spiritual guidance, it was ideological warfare. Its foundation was demonology, but its target was society itself. By framing women as morally weak and spiritually vulnerable, it planted seeds of fear that fractured communities. Mothers, daughters, healers, and caretakers were reduced to pawns in a cosmic battle they never asked to fight. And all of it, every shattered life, every body burned, was done in the name of righteousness. This was not theology, it was tyranny. But perhaps the most terrifying truth is this: it worked. For centuries, the Malleus Maleficarum was treated as divine law. Courts quoted it, priests praised it, entire villages followed it into madness. Its legacy is a grim reminder of what happens when fear is weaponized, when belief is twisted into control, and when the search for evil blinds us to our own. Even today, we are not immune to this pattern. The language has changed, but the mechanisms remain. Scapegoating, moral panic, and ideological purity still lurk beneath the surface of every society. That's why we study these texts. Not to relive the past, but to understand how easily knowledge can become violence when left unchallenged. The Malleus Maleficarum wasn't just a relic of a dark era, it's a mirror. And it asks us, what happens when we stop questioning power? Who pays the price for blind belief? This is Esoteric Legends, uncovering the hidden, exposing the forgotten, and always searching for truth in the shadows.